Welcome to Pioneer Mindset, a place where we challenge our mindset and address the discomfort in both business and life by finding clarity resulting in bold conviction. I'm your host, Garrett Ruskamp, fifth-generation farmer, husband, and father from rural Nebraska. Whether you're navigating frustration from past decisions or worry about the uncertainty you face today in your business, we're going to learn from our struggles and take on new challenges with a resilient mindset. Join me as I share my journey of struggles I've faced in agriculture as a farmer and family man. I'm ready to dive into honest conversations to tackle the mindsets surrounding key issues that rural ag business owners face that will ultimately help you gain control, leading to a profitable and sustainable business. Let's adapt to Pioneer Mindset and get to it. Welcome back, everyone, to this week's episode of Pioneer Mindset. Excited to dive into another guest episode with a good friend of mine, Trent Mastny. So we're going to be talking about all things farming, nutrient testing, and ultimately just trying to make the best decisions that we can with the best information possible. We talk about that a lot, but I think this is going to be a really kind of conversation. And so welcome to the podcast, Trent. I'll let you kind of take it away and explain, kind of who you are, where you're from, and what you do.
Yeah, thanks, Garrett. Pretty excited to be on the podcast with you. I've listened to a couple episodes in the past and stuff, and it seems like you've got a good following. So hopefully we can have a good conversation and get out what we want to talk about, and hopefully it's enjoyable to the listeners. So yeah, my name's Trent Mastny. I live south of Howells, 4 miles, and I farm with my brother and my dad. We raise corn and soybeans. We're strictly grain farmers. So kind of my background, just getting to the farm. So I graduated high school in 2012, and then I went to UNL down in Lincoln, and I kind of went a different route right away. I didn't always want to farm. I started off in ag education, and then I went to ag business. I hopped back into ag education. Then I went to agronomy, and I kind of went back to ag business. So all sorts of different ways to get back to where I am. But, my career kind of started in ag retail, actually. So I worked down at CPI. It's a large co-op down by Hastings, Nebraska. I worked there for a year, and then I kind of worked my way back towards Howells. I had an opportunity to come back to Farmers Union Co-op just outside of Howells. And I worked there for 3 years, I think, as an agronomist. So my background is in ag retail, but I kind of wanted to do ag finance too and stuff like that. So I never really wanted to come back to farm, but the more I got into it, the more I thought, hey, I really like the agronomy side of stuff. And as a farmer, this, you're doing agronomy, you're doing ag business, you're doing mechanic work, you're doing all sorts of stuff, so I was like, well, there we go. I wanted to do all of these things in college. Farming has all of them. So it works that way to be like, hey, I can do all the things I want to do and still, have the opportunity to come back and farm. So there's a long story of how I got to where I am today, farming with my brother and my dad and raising corn and soybeans. So kind of my background.
Yeah, it's funny how you mentioned all those things. Want to be an ag teacher, kind of an ag education to ag finance to retail to all that stuff. And like you said, you're kind of doing it all. Farmers, we kind of wear multiple different hats and kind of do it all. So it's our one way to almost stay diversified and stay, in different areas and different sectors of the same industry, right? And so, yeah, I kind of appreciate that background. And so you mentioned you didn't necessarily want to be a farmer or kind of come back to the farm. Explain that a little bit more.
No, I don't know if I didn't want to be, but I was like, well, what else is out there? And, at that time, it had nothing to do with the farm economy, finances, anything like that. It was just I don't know if it was a teacher, professor, or maybe it was just a speaker when I was in college. And, they talked about, at that time, it was hey, a lot of our people in high school, they're going off to college and then they're not coming back to small towns. And that really hit home to me because they were like, well, if you want to, make a difference in your small town, you guys need to be the one to go back, the ones at these conferences and doing all the leadership things and stuff. I'm really big into leadership. That's why I wanted to be in ag education in general. So anytime you're able to go to a conference or, pick out something from a leadership person or anything like that, I think that's really positive, in general. So anyways, back to that. I didn't want to. I was like, well, you know what? We'll go to college. We'll be in ag finance or banking or whatever, go to Omaha, Lincoln, start a family there, whatever. And then the more I got to think about it, I'm like, well, we're the ones that can do positive change in our own small towns and hometowns. So I was like, okay, we got to get back to our small town here eventually. So that's kind of how I worked my way back. And like the farming thing, there was an opportunity to do it. And that's why I came back. I didn't force myself into it. There was just an opportunity. Some things changed and there was just a good opportunity. So that's really the point of it. It had nothing to do with like, well, this is what I want to do. I knew it from age 10, all these things. None of that was. It was an opportunity to live in a small town. We had a family business that I could help, and then we got to where we are today. But it kind of all started with moving back to your small town and you being the positive change. And then farming kind of came along with it.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that insight. And so it kind of helps me explain because, we're from the same town, right? You were a year older than me in high school. And so we've always kind of known each other. I wouldn't say we're always close friends, just being honest, just because, you kind of had your thing and I kind of had ours. But, from the outside looking in, yeah, you being that one that was always driven to make that positive change. And so I guess kind of pat yourself on the back. And I do commend you for having that mindset because, you can kind of elaborate on it a little bit more, but you're part of the movement within our local town that's been doing a lot of change. And so I commend you for doing that and kind of having that mindset that, hey, we do have the opportunity to make a difference versus, truthfully for me, I'm just kind of more of a sit back on the side, focus on my own thing and kind of let everybody else take that role to some extent. And so it takes a lot of people like you to make the small towns thrive and to make sure that they're still viable and sustainable. So kudos to you for being able to kind of do that and take that leadership role there.
Yes, I think that's always just been in like my DNA. And like you said, not everyone is like that. And that's perfectly fine because we do need leaders that are out front and then we need leaders in the back that are going to do all the work. It's a really crucial marriage there that small towns have to have. So I'm part of the Howells Community Fund. It's an organization that raised $1 million through the Nebraska Community Foundation. They raised $500,000, and then through the Sherwood grant, they were gifted $500,000. And then how that works is our group gets to donate back, grant back is the proper term, to the Howells community, the interest off of that endowment. So roughly right now, we're anywhere from $40,000 to $50,000 every year granting back to Howells. And that has nothing to do with me. That money was raised before I was ever even part of this group. I'm just honored that I get to help out now and make a large difference in Howells. So when you think about that, Howells is what, a town of 700 people? Gosh, $50,000 a year in a town of 700 people. As we look at that as me and you, we've both got young kids and everything. It's just, it drives me nuts when people are like, well, there's nothing to do in small towns. Well, of course there's not. It's a different thing because you're not a town of, I don't know how many people Omaha has or Fremont has or whatever, but there's just so many people and the amount of money that's floated around in those communities is just way different than a town of 700 people. There's only so many people that have money to build things for entertainment purposes and all these types of things. So it's just a really neat opportunity. And we've got a lot of good support, out front or even in the background of saying, hey, I don't want to be out front. I don't want to be on this, but if you ever need help with projects, come and talk. It's a really cool thing to see how Howells can grow. And, the really neat thing is just in general. So Howells has been doing this since 2013. And now Lee started 3 or 4 years ago. They have $1 million raised. And Clarkson just started this last year. They have $1 million raised. So when you look at our small town communities here, Highway 91, just tons of support for, growing small towns. So that's really neat. And I think both of us should be pretty happy that this is kind of where we chose to raise, come back to and raise our families and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, yeah, you're right, because a lot of that has started before we even got back to the town. I mean, there's a reason that we came back to Towels to live here. And it's, yeah, it might be because we're homebodies, because we like to live on the farm, or that's where we wanted to be. But at the end of the day, we got to have a town to send our kids to school in, or to raise our kids in. And a lot of towns in Nebraska and rural America, they have kind of gone by the wayside, or maybe just haven't kept up. And so there's a lot of pride in that. I feel like Howells has always been kind of one of those that's been really good to come back to. And it's the people, right? The people are what make the town. And so that's why it's really fortunate that we get to be a part of a community like that. And even back to, I know we're not talking about soil sampling and nutrient testing at all, but back to the whole, it takes a lot of funding, and there's not as much money moving around, but the people of a small town, not just Howells, but other communities, it takes a lot of generous pockets really to make this all work, because there's so many different things that, the school's asking for money, or this fund's asking for money, or their church asking for this money, or we got this donation to here to this person that's needing help. There's so much generous giving that that's what it really takes to have a good thriving community. And okay, like I said, not to get too off into the weeds, but a lot of the things that we do here, with Pioneer Farmer, with what you do, trying to help farmers be profitable, trying to do the best that we can, it's ultimately in some form or fashion to make sure that that money kind of flows back into our communities, right? If it flows back into the farmer's pocket, it generally doesn't sit there. They go spend it somewhere. And so that's what's going to kind of help keep our communities kind of alive there. So sorry, not to get too off into the weeds, but I appreciate kind of you sharing your different perspectives there. And the other thing I want to go back to is you went to UNL, right? And so to University of Lincoln, Nebraska. And so a lot of people went there, very good school. But I always looked at the people, and this is kind of my honest opinion, the people that went to school there and just came right back to farm. I'm like, why would you waste that money and do all of that if you're just going to come back to farm? Now, in your perspective, your instance, it sounded like you really took advantage of the different opportunities that were down there, the different leadership roles. And those are the things that I'm a little bit jealous of, because I was a homebody. I went to tech school 45 minutes away. I came and I lived back here, and I really haven't done much more other than that. And so I am kind of, like I said, kudos to you that you were actually able to put yourself out there, be into different positions, different groups, and actually able to learn from those different opportunities.
See, but now like you're doing more things that I'm not. You're doing a lot of more like conferences and things like that, and more leadership roles. And now I'm kind of the homebody. So that's how it's changed a little bit. But if you're just going to go to school and just go to class and that's it, then yes, go to a tech school. Because I can't say, the classes, and because I wasn't at a tech school, so I don't know the difference in classes. But what I really got out of going to UNL and just being around a lot of people that weren't like me is just I don't know the right way to say it, but just getting a different experience that you're not used to has, I think, really helped me just in general. So we don't need to talk about that a lot, but if you're looking at that, if for some reason some of your listeners are, in high school, or parents that they've got kids looking at colleges and stuff, just take a look at it, just because the amount of experiences that you can learn from not being around people that are like you is, I think, more important than ever, especially now. So,
yeah, for sure. So going back to I think one thing that was really critical that you mentioned was the opportunity to come back to the farm, right? It wasn't necessarily something that was forced, because I feel like that happens all the time. We got, a father who wants to bring his son or daughter back to the operation, and maybe we tend to force something. Maybe we tend to buy a piece of ground or extend ourselves where maybe we shouldn't, or just try to, like I said, force the opportunity. And we all know sometimes what happens when we force things, it just doesn't work out maybe as good as it could. So walk me through that. What was that kind of opportunity? What did that look like? And then even we can elaborate more on, so you had an older brother that was already farming, and he's a few years older than you, kind of established. I mean, walk me through what it was like to come back into the operation. Were you worried about there being enough, or what did that ultimately look like for you guys?
So I've got two older brothers, 11 and 10 years older than me. So Matt, my oldest brother, he lives in Fremont, works for CoBank, and he's an ag lender. He comes back and helps every now and then and stuff. But, farming that's, he liked ag finance way better, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. And Justin, he's 9 years older than me, but he actually went to school to be an auto body painter to paint cars. So he worked in Omaha at B Street Auto Body for at least 5 years and painted cars. So it was just nobody came back, right away. So it was just, it was dad. He was farming and we'd come and help when we could and things like that. It was him and mom. It's just the way it was, in the late 2000s. So we've kind of always talked about this, me and Justin, was, hey, Justin, he was 5 years removed from the farm before he came back. And I think that's really valuable. I was 4 years removed from the farm, worked somewhere else, had multiple different bosses, and then came back to the farm. So just in general, I think it's super crucial if you're able to. Now, not every operation's able to because you're lacking for help or you're, a health issue or health situation or finance situation or something. Not everyone's the same. But if you're able to, I think being able to have multiple different bosses, having a job or two off the farm before coming back is really valuable. Just because it's really easy, and you know this and I know this. Okay, we're our own bosses. Man, if you're not motivated, it's real easy not to do much during the day. Especially on a day like today. I don't know, we got a little under a half inch of rain or whatever, and it's cloudy and kind of cold outside and all sorts of stuff, so having just that experience off the farm, I think that's really helped us. But again, we were able to do that. Not everyone's able to have the luxury of doing that. Like we said, some people need things right away and you got to come back. So that's kind of how our situation kind of got going. For us, it works. Now, it doesn't mean it's always going to work, but for now, it works really well.
And I think you say the luxury of being able to work off the farm. Some people might see that if your end goal is to get back to the farm 100% full time, some people might see that as a roadblock or an obstacle that they have to go work off farm. I would agree, just like with you, that I think that's a very good opportunity or learning experience to work off the farm. I was also one that liked it. I worked a couple jobs here and there. We all did to some extent. But for whatever the reason, and it's probably a downfall, but I didn't necessarily like working for somebody else. I mean, even if there was a job that I liked, it was just something about not being my own boss. And that was probably just because when I grew up in high school, just kind of working on the farm, working with dad, to some extent, even though I was working for dad, I was still kind of in control with everything that we're doing there. And that was probably somewhat of a downside, right? And so that's to where I had a hard time actually working for somebody else. But there's so much that we can learn, so many different perspectives we can have, different ways to doing things, even if it's just another farmer out there, right? But I also think even being in a different industry or different sector of the industry is also important just to get that, like I said, the different perspective. So like I said, good job for you. So back to the opportunity coming back, what did that look like? And I think that's going to kind of segue into kind of the main meats of our conversation today.
For sure. So how that looked like, someone approached us and had 100 acres to rent. And so that's kind of where the opportunity came into. And then another guy approached us and said, hey, I want to slow down. Can you help custom farm 100 acres, 200 acres? I don't quite remember. And so we thought about that and we said, okay, that'll work. But it was like, okay, myself needed to also bring back something, some sort of money making adventure that we weren't putting more stress on the farm.
You make a good comment about needing to bring something back to the farm. And I keep kind of going back to as far as don't force it. And I feel like sometimes it's really important to learn what not to do in some cases. And I feel like a lot of people, if you bring somebody back to the farm, bring Junior back to the farm, just because you need the extra help, or maybe because you picked up a couple acres or something like that, nothing wrong with that, but at the same time, I feel like you're not necessarily setting yourself up for success. I feel like that's a really good motto, just to always making sure whoever's coming back, they're bringing something back that's going to add value to the operation. So it sounds like that's kind of what you were trying to do in your guys' operation.
Yeah, that's kind of what we were trying to do. And with my background with agronomy and things like that, I really loved looking at soil tests and fertility recommendations and all sorts of stuff. And I got pretty comfortable at, in ag retail of doing variable rate fertilizer prescriptions and things like that. So we thought that would be a good opportunity, to do that. And the more we kind of thought about that, we're like, okay, we just put it into numbers and said, whatever your value is. If your value is 50,000, 60,000, 70,000, whatever it is, for a yearly salary or how much you think you'd make, what else can we do on the farm to offset that? Are we spending $10,000, $20,000 in custom application? If we are, for like dry fertilizer, if we are, can we spend $10,000 or $20,000, get our own spreader, but save it, over the long run by doing our own custom application? Or another one was we have our own seed treater, just a pro box to pro box seed treater. And at that time, it was like $17,000, 2019 when we got it. But my gosh, we can treat our own beans for $3, so we can save $10 an acre. Well, there you go. I mean, you do a couple of those things, and you're already helping pay for that person back. So that's how we looked at it, as right away as you got into that. Because I think it's just my opinion, doesn't have to be right or anything. But when you think about, okay, people coming back, you can't put a strain on the operator just because you add another person. That's the most probably important thing that I look at just in general. So,
well, truthfully, your opinion is wrong. No, I say that because literally I heard this this was back in COVID already, and that just stuck with me, is no matter what your opinion is, it's always wrong. I mean, that's just with anything. Everybody's always going to disagree. But no, in all seriousness, I agree, because most of the time we do put a strain back at the operation. And most of the time, and it sounds like in your case, probably a combination of picking up a few acres, but then also just getting creative and bringing somebody back. We don't necessarily have to pick up 1,000 acres to bring, one person back to the farm, because that probably is putting a pretty big strain on. You got to increase capital, increase workload, and all that other fun stuff. So I think it's great that you were able to kind of get creative there. And so I guess tell me about, you guys got your main farming kind of entity. What else have you kind of been able to do on the side to really kind of basically keep it from being a strain back to the operation to get both you and your brother back?
So we started when I first got back in 2019. So Dad always sold seed corn and seed beans and stuff like that to neighbors. We tried to do that. He didn't sell for quite a few years. He kind of stopped in the mid 2000s, late 2000, 2010, somewhere in there. And so we tried to bring that back, but my gosh, in our area, you can throw a rock and it's seed. I hated it. It was like the worst thing ever, going to farmers and like, hey, do you want to try some seed? Like, sure, and then they're like, well, why is yours better? I'm like, well, it's not. There's no difference. Like, there's no difference between what I'm selling you and what Pioneer's selling you and what DeKalb's selling you and, all this stuff. And I was just like, this is a waste of time, because I feel like I'm wasting what I know with fertilizer recommendations and soil sampling and all this stuff. So we tried that for a year and we said to heck with it. And then kind of how our journey got started, this would be a good segue into soil sampling and everything. So how our journey got started in 2020 with Agronomy 365 and BW Fusion. It was in the fall, and I'll remember it. I remember this pretty vividly. We were going to combine beans, and at that time, like for the past 3 years, we had awful problems with corn residue and planting beans the next year. We could not get our beans in the ground with all the corn residue. So, and on that time we were on 15-inch beans, so we didn't have row cleaners. It was awful. So we were planting some beans 4 inches deep and some beans were on top of the ground. Like, we'd have huge gaps. That was a big struggle. So, and I remember it. I saw something on Twitter or Facebook or something, and it was a product called Meltdown from BW. And I had no idea what this was, but I kind of followed it for a really long time. And I was like, well, let's send a request for some information. And we got a call back that day and set up a meeting after harvest, and away we went. And it was we had like a 2.5 hour meeting, and we just went through like soil sampling, and not your traditional soil sampling, but we went through like the Haney test and biological testing and all sorts of stuff. And it was the best meeting I've ever sat in my life. So that's kind of how it started in 2020. And now we've really evolved from there because there's a lot of stuff that's gone on from there. So,
Yeah. And I think really what that comes down to is, kind of where the pain of staying the same had to outweigh the pain of change. I kind of make that comment. So all of a sudden you just had this pain or this challenge that you're trying to deal with, and it might seem pretty minute, but the challenge of just trying to get your soybeans planted right and do the best that you can, right? All of a sudden that turns into all this whole new adventure, basically, just by making a simple phone call or reaching out to this company. You didn't know what it's probably going to turn into that time, but just trying to decide, okay, we cannot do this any longer. We have to do something different. We have to find something that's going to help us get through this challenge. And I feel like we have to all go through that at some point or another. So it sounds like you were kind of at that point in 2020. I didn't realize it was that long ago that you kind of started with them. So from that point, how did it kind of progress as to where we are today, or what have you kind of been able to pick up and do from all of that?
so it started in 2020, but it was in two separate. Okay, this is going to get a little confusing. So we had BW Fusion with the products, and then we had SWOT maps with our soil sampling and everything. So it's a little confusing. So SWOT maps is a company out of Canada, and they do soil mapping, and then you go and you sample off of those soil zones. So we actually started with that right away in 2020. We had one field, they came and demoed because we were doing 2.5 acre grid sampling for like 10 years. And the whole adage of 2.5 acre grids is, hey, you're going to get in 4 years when you resample, your field is going to be even on nutrient levels. Well, we were doing it for 10 to 12 years and they weren't even. And you were still spending money on fertility. And you're like, what in the world is going on? We're doing everything we're supposed to be doing with these 2.5 acre grids, and we still have spots in the field that are, we're putting on 300 pounds of 1152O and the yield isn't going up, or the yield is worse than where we didn't put any on. And so we had to look at something different, and we found SWOT maps to come and do a couple demo fields for us and take a look at that. So we became dealers for them for 2 to 3 years, something like that. And then finally in 2024, we switched everything to Agronomy 365 with BW Fusion. So Agronomy 365 and BW Fusion are the same company. BW Fusion is just that product line. Agronomy 365, they have soil sampling, soil testing, tissue testing, their lab, everything like that. So when I talk about those two, that's what those. So it's kind of a long way to get it to where we are today. Was again another pain point where we were like, gosh, we're spending all this money on fertilizer and it's not showing up in yield, because where we put on more fertilizer, how come it's not good? And how come our fields aren't? Like, the whole goal with 2.5 acre grids was to get to a point where you don't have to 2.5 acre grid anymore, because the field was completely even on NPK, pH. My gosh, guys have been doing 2.5 acre grid since 2000, and they're still 2.5 acre grid in 2000 and very poor rate. I'm like, well, it's 25 years later. So the whole goal of that was to make a field even, and it's not even yet. So you're just going to keep pounding our head against the wall? We said, no, there's got to be something else. Now, are zones perfect? No, but they're a heck of a lot better than what they are. And the reason is because we are taking our topography piece, so how the ground lays, the hills, the slopes, the valleys. We're taking water, how water flows, because in our area, we have hills. Even where there's flat ground, water still goes to certain spots, and water still sits there. Water still runs off there. And then we're also taking parent material as well. So when you combine all those, you get a really neat soil zone map that you can go and soil sample on. And when you go and you look at these maps and you go out to the field, it is a no-brainer. When you're looking at this map on your phone and then you go out to the field. And I've tested it on everywhere from down by North Bend, which is, as flat as can be, flat pancake, all the way up to Allen, Nebraska, which is just south of Sioux City. And they have mountains up there. And it always comes back to the exact same, is these maps are about as accurate as you can be for the technology we have right now. So that's a roundabout way of why we went to 2.5 acre grids to where we are now. And one more thing on that is because we wanted to do variable rate plantings prescriptions for corn. and you can't variable rate plant prescription corn on 2.5 acres.
Yeah, the phrase that you said that really hit home for me was you were doing everything you were, quote, supposed to be doing, unquote. And I feel like that's where we are a lot of times, to where like we're doing everything we're supposed to be doing and we're just not getting the results that we want. It's just not working. So all of a sudden, you got to ask yourself, well, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and getting the same results, right? So that's kind of where a lot of that change comes from, like we've been talking about, trying something new. And so I guess kind of to go back a little bit, this is to where kind of Trent and I got connected. And this is to where, we can explain a little bit more of the nuts and bolts as to, what Agronomy 365 has to offer and how we got connected. But about a year ago, I've been doing soil sampling on our farm trying for a long time. And we do it pretty regularly. I mean, I'd say every 2 to 3 years. A lot of times it's before we go to corn. A lot of times it was just your traditional samples. But we've been kind of bouncing around all over the place using this company or that company. And so I was just trying to find something that seemed like it worked for us. And so, we're always using just traditional samples and sending them to the local lab. Then I started doing more research and we found about the Haney test. That's been a pretty big one here lately that a lot of people talk about, is the Haney test. And you can elaborate on that a little bit more. But so I there for a couple of years, started pulling the Haney test through a different company, and it worked. And they were using kind of zones similar to you were, but just didn't seem like it was quite jiving with, okay, now we have this data. Now, what do we do with it? And that's ultimately kind of what led me to you, was making sure that we have, one, a good way to collect the data. And so the Haney test, and they are a little bit more expensive. So we don't want to pull 2.5 acre grids of a Haney test, because that would be outrageous. And so we want to make sure that we're getting good data. It's representative of the field. And then we can take that and actually utilize it for practical information, practical logistics. And so making sure that we can get that return back on that information we have. And so that's to where I kind of found you guys and BaselineRx and the different basically zones that they create. So let's talk about BaselineRx. Let's talk about how like Agronomy 365 creates the zones and what that actually look like.
So all BaselineRx is through Agronomy 365 is just like the fall. It's creating the map, sampling, and pretty much creating the prescription for fertility and planting and everything like that. So that's all that is. It's just the whole program. So how the map gets made is, we already talked about it. It's water flow, it's topography, it's parent material. So we take all of those metrics in there, and then we create anywhere from 3 zones to 5 zones on that type of map. And the big thing that I have a lot of questions on is, okay, so I have this map. Do I need to go soil sample? So all this map is it's a base map. It's your baseline map that you use to go and soil sample and do everything off of this. So once you get this map, you never have to make this map again unless you take out a bunch of terraces or you move a bunch of dirt work for some reason, because the baseline map isn't ever changing. Your soil sample numbers are always changing, but the parent material, your topography and where water flows, it's usually never going to change. So that's the first part of it. And then the second part is you take this map and then you go and you soil sample off. And, you soil sample based off of, we call it the Indicator Complete soil test through Next Level Ag and Agronomy 365. So it's your standard soil test plus the Haney test and a couple other things in there. For those that don't know the Haney test is simply a biology test. And I'm not going to go into because I don't know it, like the exact definitions, and there's a lot smarter people than me on it. So I don't want to give a bad rap on it, screw it up. So just the one thing that I really took from it was, okay, when it rains water. It doesn't rain harsh chemicals that are in like your standard soil test. So if it rains, what is your plant seeing for nutrition? It's seeing that water is releasing nutrients from the soil into, the root area, and the root exudates are giving off exudates to take up that nutrition. So, but with your standard test, we're using harsh chemicals to see what's really in the ground. Well, that doesn't tell you what's getting released when it rains. So that's kind of the difference between them that I really like to understand. But the Indicator Complete has both. It has your pH, it has your, your P1s, your P2s, your potassium parts per million, your pH, your base saturations, all of that. But then it has every other metric under the sun. I believe there's 65 or 70 metrics that we're looking at. So it's a pretty extensive soil test. And we're on year 5 of it, and I'm still learning. You're on year 1 of it, and it's like foreign language. It really is. That's probably the biggest thing that I tell people is don't give up on year 1 because you don't understand it, because there's just so much. We're just so used to looking at, okay, my pH and my buffer pH is this. We need to apply this amount of tons of lime. My P1 is 15 and it needs to be 25. Let's go put on 250 pounds of MAP and away we go. Well, that's fine, but there's so much more to the soil because it's a living organism.
Yeah, and so that's what drew me to the Haney test when we started pulling that a couple of years ago, was just the extraction method. So I feel like you're getting a better representation of, what the soil is actually releasing and what's going to be available to the crop, right? And so, and that company at the time, when I first started learning about it, they're like, well, you're going to take this test, you're going to spend this money, but then you're going to be able to save it on fertilizer. And so that was kind of their selling point, which is true to an extent. But I think the big part of there is just realizing, what's going to actually be released to the plant and then using that information. But then, okay, going back to what really drew me to kind of Agronomy 365 and Baseline, but then even the Indicator Complete with the soil test we're talking about. I hope we're not confusing the listeners because we're throwing a lot of different terms out there. But the big thing here was, taking this Haney test, but there were some things on here that we just still weren't getting that traditional test has that is valuable, like kind of base saturations or utilizing some of that same information that we still kind of need. And so that's where I was like, okay, well, how can we do this as efficiently as possible? And that's where I said, okay, if we can have a set number of zones per field, that's very accurate representation of the field. It's going to be really consistent and something that we can really rely on. Now we take that and we're only sending in a small number of samples per field. So we're not spending as much money, but we're still getting really practical data that we can utilize and make good information off of or make good decisions off of. So that's ultimately, like I said, what my kind of value is within the test is being able to utilize that information. Now, and here's where I want to kind of turn this. And if you have any additional thoughts on that, that's fine. But so we're actually just at a meeting at Trent's here with some local growers. And the one thing that with BW Fusion, with Agronomy 365, they're just really progressive like all companies are. But the big thing that I kind of saw another gap here currently was, okay, now we have a good way to zone the fields. We have a good way to map it. We've pulled the samples off of that. We've got really good samples, really good information. Now let's take this one step further. How do we use this information to actually make practical practical decisions within each of our operations that are so very different? So explain how that process has been like, even for you guys in your operation.
It's been a struggle. I was probably the worst part of being a, Agronomy 365 BWP dealer. Was, okay, we've got this great soil test. Now, how do I, as a farmer first, dealer second, how do I make sure that what I'm saying is correct when I tell you, compared to like if you go and talk to, Danny, who is above me with BW Fusion, if he would talk? We got to make sure that that is the exact same. And it's so hard because I might be looking at something different in the soil test than Danny does. So that was the worst part about this. And there's so much information. You can't just, if you're half knowledgeable on a traditional soil test, you can probably figure out, a recommendation. Probably don't need to go to your local retailer and, have them look. Once you do it a couple of years, you can probably figure it out for the most part. With this one with 65 to 70 metrics, there's no way. And I've gotten pushback on a decent amount of saying, well, this information is all great, but I don't know how to use it. And I'm wasting my money because each test, each soil bag that you send out to the lab is $75. Your standard one is $25. Okay, it's going to add up. So you need to be able to use this information. So Agronomy 365 and BW Fusion came out with a wonderful tool, and it's called Ferticast. And what it does is it's partially AI and it's partially from all of their agronomists. They put in all of this data from their agronomists, from AI on a lot of agronomy information, So, gosh, we went to a meeting and they were talking about how many possibilities there could be within these soil tests to make a recommendation. And it was unbelievable. I don't know if it was like 1 million or 2 million or something like that. It was crazy numbers. So what they did is they came out with this tool, and it's really nice now because it's, free to the farmers that are getting soil tests and everything. And what it does is you can select your soil test, select all your practices that you do. So if you do a fall dry broadcast of fertilizer application, you can put that in there. If you do anhydrous in the fall, you can put that in there. If you do 2x2 with the planter for fertility, if you go and you side dress, put fungicide on, if you just spray everything up front, with a sprayer, you can do all that stuff. You can put that in there, and then you choose the fertilizers that you have available to you, and it will come out with a recommendation for that soil. And that's about the neatest thing that BW Fusion and Agronomy 365 on the agronomy side of it and soil sample side of it has ever come out. It's unbelievable. It makes my job a lot easier. It makes me really confident in talking to farmers now, because what I do now before I go and look at a soil sample, I will run it through Ferticast, and I will say, okay, I think I know what I need to recommend. Now Ferticast pretty much double checks it, which is really great. So, and also then you save some time when you sit down with your farmers. You're not going through, and be like, hey, this is what Ferticast came up with. What do you think of it? Let's get into the nuts and bolts right away. Instead of like going through soil samples and just like looking at, well, this number is this number is that. Ferticast looks at all that already. So that's really, really neat. And we've used it on our farm. So how we kind of do it is we put on a lot of late nitrogen, fungicide, and all those types of things. So when Ferticast came out this summer, I just double checked a lot of our fields just to make sure that, we were doing what the program kind of thought we were supposed to be doing. So that was really nice how practical it was on our farm too.
Yeah. And so for me, from the grower standpoint, so I've always been one that tried to be as analytical as we can be with the information. I like working in spreadsheets. So a few years ago, I took the time and I spent almost a full week building out this spreadsheet. So where I could have on a field by field level, I could put in, okay, here's my removal rates or my recommendations. And then, my different kind of applications at planting or at side dress or whatever the case is, I could put in all of this information. So that way it adds up, so I can see once, okay, how much have I applied versus my recommendation? And then now we got to take this one step further, use that so I can get, okay, how much tons of 32 do I need to book? And what's my price going to be and all this stuff. And it was great, but it got to be, so cumbersome to actually update and utilize to where it's not necessarily practical. That's why I'm really excited for this tool, because hopefully that'll make my job as the grower just a lot easier as well. Just even for deciding, how much I need to book, how much do I need to actually apply for, and so to playing around with different methods there. So I think this is going to be just kind of that next stepping stone to really get us closer to where we want to be, and a really good answer to a lot of the struggles that we've had so far.
Yeah, I think so. I use it on our farm a lot for trouble spots in the field, because, gosh, you ask a different person, you get a different answer on every time on what you're supposed to do. And what I really like about it is, a lot of the stuff we're like, okay, we get a recommendation. It says, well, and in our area, it's heavy manure. It's just the way it is. There's a lot of feedlots, a lot of hog confinements, chicken barns, all sorts of stuff. Like, that's just the answer that people are just like, we'll just put manure on. Well, not everyone has access to. Not everyone is going to pay an arm and a leg, all this stuff. So what I really like about Ferticast is you can put in there, this is what I have access to for fertility and my application timings and everything. And it gives you a recommendation instead of just like the easy way out, essentially. It's kind of what I look at. Well, just throw some manure on. Well, that's fine, but not everyone has access to it or whatever. Maybe not everyone wants to use it. So it's just extremely flexible, just in general. So I think that's going to be a big help for, the farmers that we try to help, and, hopefully everyone uses it and is going to see a benefit.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to, because there's a couple things I do want to cover here yet today. And really, I want to drive home everything we've talked about thus far as to why are we talking today? So by the time this episode comes out, we're going to be talking like mid-October. Combines are going to be rolling. People may or may not be listening to this in the field. They're not thinking about soil sampling. They're thinking about trying to get this crop out, right? But at the end of the day, we got to be somewhat proactive in what we're trying to do. And once we get that crop out, then we need to be pulling soil samples, or if that's what our plan is. And usually what happens, you're like, okay, the combine's parked. Now let's focus on this. Well, now you're kind of behind the 8 ball, right? Now things take a little bit of time to actually get in place. And even as we think about, usually we're also in the time of year with prepaying expenses for next year. Maybe we're looking at booking fertilizer. I hope not. I hope prices go down from where they're at today. But, that's always kind of the back of our mind. But, I got to ask you, why do we talk about this today? And why is this also something that we can't forget about? We can't put on the back burner. Why is this something that I'm throwing a lot at you, but why is this something that people need to actually be considering as investing into?
Okay, so for right now, the reason that we need to think about it now is if you have never done Agronomy 365 with the zone sampling, is we need to create the maps first before you can go in soil sampling. So I need to get some information from you. I need to get the boundary files. I need to get a lot of information and send that off to, our Agronomy 365 team so they can create the maps. That takes 10 days to 2 weeks. Okay, so if we do that October 1, we're looking at October 15th. So we're ready 2 weeks after that. Usually how it works is, I park the combine, I want to go sample the next day. Well, you can't. It's going to take 2 weeks to get the maps back if you're doing it the first time. So that's number one. Number two is the more and more people that I talk to is not everyone has a plan or like a rotation when they sample. It's just kind of whatever they feel like, which is fine, but are really using the information that we have to the best. What I recommend for pulling soil samples, and we just got kind of taught this at our last meeting in September, was since the Indicator Complete test is so heavy on the nitrogen aspect of it, there's so many metrics that go into it. We recommend pulling samples before anytime you put nitrogen on a crop. So like that would be if you're going to plant corn, if you're going to plant wheat, try to soil sample before that, because what we're really trying to do is we're trying to variable rate nitrogen, throughout that season. So you need to have the most up-to-date numbers to do that type of stuff. So try to get a plan in place. That's probably the biggest thing. What we did in the past was we split all of our acres up. We did an after bean harvest every 4th year, so you're doing a quarter of your acres to do that. Now what we're doing is we're doing before corn. So it's half of our acres every year, after beans and stuff. And that way you got the technology, we got to use it. And it has saved us a lot of money in fertility. And, our yields have at least stayed the same, if not have gone up. So, and our soil, you can tell the difference in soils as well. So, when you're looking at that, just the biggest thing is have a plan, split your fields up. And if you can't do it every other year because of, finances or whatever it might be, maybe every 3rd year, there's creative ways to do it. But the biggest thing is have a plan so we can stick to that plan. So that's where we got to start now. And you can speak to this too. You run the combine a lot. I don't. But it's fresh in your mind. When you go through that field and you're like, man, this area of the field is just not doing what it's supposed to be doing. Or this area of the field is really, really good. Right away in the combine, you're like, why? That's the first thing that usually people ask. And then once you're done combining, nobody really cares. Unless you're going through your maps and looking at everything like, your yield maps and stuff like that. So it's fresh in your mind. So let's figure out the reason what's going on and, how we can address it.
Yeah. And then I guess I'll kind of piggyback on top of that as far as the financial side of things. Everybody's going to be looking this next year as a place where they can cut and try to save as much money because we need to be profitable. And this next year does not look good. It does not look like there's going to be much of an opportunity profitable at this current moment. But at the same time, I guess I would be really leery about cutting something that's going to help us make better decisions. Okay. And that's exactly what I feel like soil sampling and these nutrient tests are going to allow us to do. And then furthermore, and this is something you can speak to as well, and that's why my initial thoughts of getting Trent on here was actually the spring when we were coming up with our variable rate planting maps. So we variable rated all of our corn this year. And, in the grand scheme of things, we didn't necessarily cut back our populations a lot, but we just put the seed where the seed needed to be. And that's the big thing there. And so, there's some opportunities to maybe save some money there, maybe just be more efficient with the inputs that we have. I mean, there's endless ways that this can ultimately get a return on investment. That's what we want to know. Okay, I'm willing to invest in something that's going to get us return on investment. And this is one of those things that I think is it. And I'm not trying to be a salesman here, and I know Trent is going to probably say the same thing, but this is, even if there's something else that you're looking at when it comes to a soil sampling side of things, is just be really analytical as far as, let's not cut the areas that might actually potentially hurt us, right? And so these are the things that we can make sure that if we're spending money on, 60 pounds of nitrogen, is this where we need to be spending money? Or maybe we can cut back on this area and, throttle up on this area. We're ultimately trying to maximize that ROI. And I think this is one of those things that helps us do that.
Yeah, you talk about return on investment. And the biggest thing is do not cut if you don't test. That's probably the biggest thing. If you're going to just say, hey, I'm not going to apply any phosphorus this year, that's fine. But you got to know where you can afford to cut that. And, a traditional, I'm going to be a salesman here, a traditional soil test is going to tell you, because your parts per million might be 10, but you might have a lot available in the soil solution. And you might have phosphorus numbers that are 40 ppm, and it might not be available because it might be tied up, due to iron and pH issues like that. So just, you got to test before you cut. And then I also want to talk about a little bit, I like how you mentioned, why you wanted to do variable rate planting. We've got a lot of data on this, and it's not just my data, it's a lot of people that have done this. And the whole goal with variable rate planting, for us anyways, is to not cut any seed. If you're planting 28,000 corn population, we're going to variable rate it, but it's going to be 28,000 average. So you might go down to 22,000 and you might go up to 38,000 and then vary it in between. So when you think about it like that, we're putting the seeds where they need to be based on water, nutrient availability, less seed on erosion spots, whatever it might be. But we have constantly seen 21, when it was really, really good year, it was 7 bushel difference where we flat rated it compared to variable rated. In 22, where it was super dry, we had like 120 bushel corn, it was 7 bushel. The exact same thing. And last year, where it was pretty average, average rainfall, average crop, everything like that, it was 7 bushel. And that's from 3 different people. So it works. That's pretty much the main thing that I could say about that. So when you think about it, we just got to look at our return on investments on things and not just cut blanket and blindly cut everything.
Yeah, no, I agree. So, well, Trent, I really appreciate the conversation today. As we get to rounding this out, are there any additional comments or anything that you guys want listeners to know? And you can answer that, but the one question that I did want to ask you is, people are interested in this. We're pretty local to each other. We're not far apart. But what about you? Sounds like you work with somebody from Allen. That's a good, at least probably 50, 60 miles away. Do people have to be local to actually maybe work with you? So I pull my own soil samples. I know you do some for other kind of clients that you work with or customers. What does that look like if people are kind of interested in maybe learning more, but also kind of working with you?
Yeah, so we've got farmers from down by Lincoln to David City to Allen to a lot of local ones around here, around the Howells area. So it kind of just depends. But everyone that's kind of come to us is looking for a different solution. And it really starts with the zone maps. So that's kind of how people have found us and things like that. And how our services kind of work is, so we can pull soil samples, the farmer can pull soil samples. I will say, I would really like when farmers pull their own soil samples. And I want you to speak on this real quick, Garrett. When you pull your own soil samples, you can see the different textures and the different soil colors in every field. This happens every time, and it happened down in Lincoln. It happened all the way up to Allen. It happened in the sand. I did it out by St. Paul, Grand Island area, so it's sandy out there. And it happens and it doesn't matter, it happens every field. There is per zone, the textures and the colors for the soils are different. And it's the exact same. All your zone 1s look identical. All your zone 2s look identical. And you throw those in a bag and you send them off to the lab. So can you just speak, is that what you've seen in your experience?
Yeah, I would say so. Generally, when I'm pulling soil samples, I do my best to pay attention to that. But as we all know, we're busy. We're just trying to get some things done or trying to cross something off the to-do list. And hopefully, if you are pulling your own soil samples, you do it and you're proactive. You get the maps in, you do it so it's warm enough right after the combine parks versus when it's really cold and you're just trying to get it done quickly. But yes, I would say generally when I was out there pulling the soil samples, I'm pulling in, I'm like, okay, in this zone, it looks like, man, looks like it's really nice. I got an earthworm that I just pulled up that was in the sample, or I got, this looks like it's some really decent soil versus, man, this sample here is really tight. It's really heavy and it's just a different texture. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the first initial kind of sign of starting to learn something a little bit as far as just noticing and being aware that there's differences in the zones.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So yeah, no, that's good comments there. Any additional comments as we kind of get to round this out today?
Not really. I just want everyone to, take a look at your soil sampling program and, really what's your goal of it? Or is your goal of just, go to a retailer who sells fertilizer? Remember this. Are you going to get your soil samples pulled from a retailer that is selling you fertilizer? Or do you want to go to someone that is not selling you fertilizer? Yes, we have products at BW Fusion, whatever, but that has nothing to do with like pulling a soil sample and looking at your fertility program. I am not selling you tons of fertilizer. So just think about that as you plan for your soil samples and everything like that. And thanks for having me on, and hopefully it was good, and hopefully, people learned some stuff. People can reach out. I've got a Twitter page. I'm on Facebook, but gosh, I don't know my Twitter handle or anything like that. So, you can reach out that way. You can reach out on BW Fusion's website as well. There's like a dealer location. We are JTM Ag out of Howells, Nebraska. And then I'll just give my phone number real quick. I don't know if that's what people do on here, but that's how you can just send me a text or a call or anything if you're interested. So my phone number is 402-750-9218. That's the best way to get a hold of me since I don't know my Twitter handle or anything like that. So.
No, absolutely. That sounds great. And I do appreciate Trent being on this today. I know, it always kind of goes back to the phrase of we try to make hay when the sun shines, right? Well, last night we got rain. It sounds like it was a really variable in our neck of the woods. I feel like we've kind of gotten to the point we're in a cycle of a wetter pattern. So we've now gotten to the point where we're trying to brag on how little of rain we actually got. And sounds like Trent was the winner there because he had less than what we did. But, I appreciate it working out today that we were able to take the time to record this because it's a busy time of year, lots of things going on. And that's just kind of the last driver, I would say, as you're getting busy, as you're thinking about getting into the fields, as you are in the fields, you're just trying to hammer down, getting this crop out. We can't forget about trying to farm on for next year, trying to do the best that we can to be proactive, looking into next year, 2026. And ultimately, the big kind of goal here with this conversation today was trying to learn more so that way we can kind of utilize the information, the technology that's out there to make the best decisions possible. And so I like I said, I really appreciate Trent coming on today. But, for now, that's all we got. And we'll catch you guys next time. Thanks for tagging along with me today as we sharpened our mindsets. If you've gained insight from today's episode, be sure to take a screenshot to share or send this episode to somebody who might also find value in it. For more, follow me on Instagram at Garrett Ruskamp or on Facebook, and join me next time for more conviction through clarity.